Ever been to an air show? You know the ones with those incredible pilots pulling off stunts that seem to defy gravity? It's like they're dancing with the wind, their planes moving with impossible precision. How do they do it?
It is a bit like a dance, actually. A carefully choreographed dance in 3 dimensions.
Exactly. And the secret behind those jaw-dropping maneuvers, it's all about mastering what pilots call ground reference maneuvers. And before you think, well, that's cool, but I'm never planning to fly a loop-the-loop, these maneuvers are anything but just fancy flying.
You're right, they're fundamental to pretty much everything a pilot does. From the moment you lift off the runway to that smooth touchdown, you're relying on these skills.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What exactly are ground reference maneuvers? I mean, aren't all maneuvers technically in reference to the ground?
Good point. You're always trying to be aware of where you are in space, of course. But ground reference maneuvers take it to another level. Think of it this way. In basic flight training, you're focused on how the airplane moves in response to your control inputs: pitch, roll, yaw.
Right, like learning the individual steps of a dance.
Exactly. But with ground reference maneuvers, you're moving beyond those individual steps and learning to use the ground itself as your guide. You're essentially weaving those basic maneuvers together into a more intricate pattern, using landmarks and the horizon to maintain a specific flight path.
So it's about becoming one with the airplane, A&D the environment. I imagine it's a pretty incredible feeling once you get the hang of it.
Oh, absolutely. There's nothing quite like the feeling of smoothly guiding your plane along a precise path using nothing but your senses and the world around you.
Speaking of senses, I bet it's not just your eyes that come into play here.
You're absolutely right. It's about feeling the airplane, too. Just like a driver can feel the road through the steering wheel, a pilot gets constant feedback from the controls, the pressure on the yoke, the resistance of the rudder pedals. It's all about interpreting those subtle cues along with what you're seeing.
So much of flying, it seems, is about this constant dance between human skill and the forces of nature.
Yeah.
But I imagine there's also a mental game involved here, right?
Yeah.
Like it can't be easy to maintain focus when you're maneuvering at low altitudes.
Absolutely. It's a mental juggling act, especially at first. Think about everything you're trying to do simultaneously. Control the airplane's attitude, track your position relative to the ground, scan for other aircraft or obstacles, monitor your instruments.
Yeah.
Oh, and did I mention that you have to constantly compensate for the wind, too?
Wait, what? Compensate for the wind? That sounds tricky.
That's where it gets really interesting. Remember how we talked about the ground being your dance floor? Well, wind is like that unseen dance partner who's constantly trying to lead you astray.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So how DO pilots deal with this invisible dance partner? Do they just muscle their way through?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But it's more about finesse than brute strength. You see, pilots don't actually calculate precise angles to counteract the wind. Instead, they learn to feel the drift and adjust their heading accordingly.
Feel the drift. That sounds almost intuitive.
It is after lots of practice. Think of it like a sailboat crossing a river. The current will constantly try to push the boat off course, right? To compensate, the sailor doesn't point the boat directly at their destination. They aim slightly upstream at an angle that counteracts the current's force.
Ah, I see. So pilots are doing something similar, constantly adjusting their angle to stay on track.
Exactly. And the amount of correction needed depends on a few things: wind speed, wind direction relative to the aircraft, and even the airplane's airspeed.
So the faster the wind, the more you need to adjust. Makes sense. But I'm starting to realize that there's a whole lot more to these maneuvers than meets the eye. It's like a beautiful blend of physics, perception, and even a bit of artistry.
You're getting it, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Well, lucky for us, we have a whole deep dive to go. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Ready to add some turns and twists.
Always up for a challenge. What comes next in our ground reference maneuver playbook?
Let's talk about the art of turning. Specifically, how pilots maintain a constant turn radius while battling the wind.
Okay, I'm already sensing a challenge here. Turning on its own seems simple enough, but I imagine the wind throws a wrench into things, right?
It definitely adds a layer of complexity. Let me ask you this. Have you ever heard of ground speed?
Ground speed, you mean how fast the plane is moving relative to the ground, not just its airspeed?
Exactly. And that ground speed directly affects your turn radius. Higher ground speed means a larger turn radius, and lower ground speed means a smaller one. And guess what has a huge impact on your ground speed while turning?
Let me guess. The wind.
Bingo! Imagine you're flying a perfect circle in a 10-knot wind. When you're turning downwind, With the wind at your back, your ground speed is highest. To keep that turn radius constant, you actually need a steeple bank angle around 45 degrees in this case.
Steeper bank angle, so you're tilting the wings further to make a tighter turn.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. As you continue that turn and start flying upwind into the wind, your ground speed decreases. To maintain that same turn radius, you need to decrease your bank angle. To around 33 degrees, it's a constant dance with the wind, feeling that change in pressure and adjusting your bank angle throughout the turn.
Wow. So it's this constant adjustment throughout the turn. Steeper bank downwind, shallower bank upwind, and it all comes down to that changing ground speed. I never realized how much goes into simply making a turn.
It's a beautifully choreographed dance between the pilot, the plane, and the wind. And that's just one example. Pilots practice a whole series of ground reference maneuvers to hone their skills and build those instincts.
Speaking of practice, is there a particular maneuver that's considered a staple in pilot training, something that really puts all these skills to the test?
Absolutely. It's called the rectangular course.
Rectangular course. Sounds pretty self-explanatory. Fly in the shape of a rectangle. Got it.
It is, in essence, flying a perfect rectangle in the sky, maintaining a constant altitude, airspeed, and distance from each side of that imaginary rectangle.
Sounds deceptively simple. But knowing what we do now about wind and ground speed, I'm betting it's anything but.
You're catching on quickly. The rectangular course is a fantastic way for pilots to practice everything we've talked about so far. Wind correction, bank angle adjustments, dividing their attention between multiple tasks. It's like a final exam for basic ground reference maneuvers.
I bet it helps prepare them for landing too, right? I mean, approaching a runway seems like it would involve some of the same skills.
You're absolutely right. The rectangular course simulates the pattern an aircraft flies when entering and exiting the landing pattern at an airport. It's all about precision and control, setting the stage for those smooth takeoffs and landings.
Okay, so the rectangular course helps pilots master the fundamentals. But what about those more advanced maneuvers we see at air shows? The ones that really get the adrenaline pumping. Turning in a rectangle is cool, but what about those crazy S-turns I've heard about?
Buckle up, because we are about to explore the exciting world of S-turns, turns around a point, and the ultimate test of precision eights on pylons.
Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's start with turns around a point. What's the key challenge there?
The name pretty much says it all. You're trying to maintain a perfect circle around a specific point on the ground. Sounds simple enough, right?
Until you factor in the wind. And
Yeah.
ground speed. And probably a million other things.
Use. Just like with our constant radius turns, wind speed and direction are constantly changing your ground speed throughout the maneuver. So to maintain that perfect circle around the point, pilots are constantly adjusting their bank angle and wind correction throughout the entire 360 degrees of the turn.
It's like spinning a plate on a stick, except the stick is invisible and the plate is trying to fly away.
That's a very vivid analogy. And just to keep things interesting, the pilot also has to make sure they're not drifting away from the point laterally.
So it's like this three-dimensional puzzle they're solving in real time. I can see why mastering turns around a point is a big deal. But how does this then lead to the infamous S-turns? Is that like a series of turns around a point?
Not quite. Imagine a straight line on the ground, say, a road or a fence line. With S-turns, you're essentially flying two opposite turns on either side of that line, creating a graceful S-shaped path in the sky.
Ah, I see. So it's like you're weaving back and forth across that line, almost like a skier carving down a slope.
You could say that. The real challenge with S-turns lies in those transition points where you're rolling out of one turn and immediately into the next, all while maintaining that constant altitude and distance from the road.
And of course, all while compensating for wind drift and ground speed changes. It's like the ultimate test of coordination and finesse. So how about we move on to those eights you mentioned?
A personal favorite. We'll start with eights along a road. Imagine taking those S-turns we just talked about, and instead of reversing direction, you close the loop on each turn, creating a figure-8 pattern along that straight line.
Okay, so it's like two back-to-back turns around a point, except your reference is a line instead of a single point.
Precisely. And as with all these maneuvers, wind is your constant companion, demanding precise bank angle adjustments and wind correction to maintain that perfect figure-8 shape.
I'm noticing a theme here. Wind always seems to be the ultimate party crasher. But I guess that's part of what makes it so challenging and fun, right?
It keeps things interesting, but think of it this way. Mastering these maneuvers in varying wind conditions is what elevates a pilot from simply controlling the airplane to truly dancing with it.
I love that analogy. But I have to ask, If eights along a road are a step up from S-turns, what comes next? What's the grand finale of ground reference maneuvers?
That, my friend, would be the maneuver known as eights on pylons. And trust me, it's every bit as challenging and rewarding as it sounds.
Eights on pylons. Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me. What are pylons and why are they so special?
Picture this. 2 points on the ground, maybe a couple of brightly colored barrels or markers. Those are your pylons.
Okay, so far so good. And we're flying a figure eight around them.
You're on the right track, but here's where it gets really interesting. With eights on pylons, you're not just maintaining a constant distance from them horizontally. You're also adjusting your altitude to maintain a specific visual reference point.
Wait, adjusting altitude too. Now you're just showing off. How on earth do pilots wrap their heads around that?
This is where it gets seriously impressive. Imagine a line extending from the pilot's eyes to the pylon. We call this the visual reference line. As the airplane moves around the pylon, the goal is to keep that visual line parallel to the airplane's lateral axis. It should feel like the airplane is pivoting around that pylon.
That's some next level spatial awareness. It's like they're not just flying the airplane, they are the airplane. But how do they even know what altitude to maintain? It's not like there's a giant ruler in the sky. Or is there?
There's not a ruler, but there is something called the pivotal altitude. This is the sweet spot where at a given ground speed, the pylon appears to stay still along that visual reference line. Pilots actually learn to feel this altitude shift rather than relying solely on instruments.
Wow, feel it. That's incredible. It's like this whole other level of sensory perception. You're telling me they can sense when the forces of lift, gravity, and their turning rate all balance out in a way that makes the pylon appear stationary.
You got it. It's a skill developed through hours of practice, but once they lock onto that pivotal altitude, it minimizes the need for constant adjustments.
That is amazing. But I have to imagine that even the slightest gust of wind could throw things off completely.
You're right. Eights on pylons are incredibly challenging, even for experienced pilots. It demands perfect coordination between bank angle, altitude, and wind correction. One tiny miscalculation and that perfect pivot is gone.
Okay, so it's the ultimate test. But why is it so important? What does mastering this maneuver actually teach a pilot?
It's about more than just technical skill. Eights on pylons teach a pilot to trust their instincts to feel the airplane's movement in harmony with the environment. It's about developing that almost sixth sense for where the airplane is in space, which is invaluable in all aspects of flying.
I think you just summed up the essence of ground reference maneuvers perfectly.
Yeah.
It's about becoming one with the airplane in the sky. It's about turning calculations into intuition and fear into mastery.
Beautifully said. It's about transforming the invisible forces of nature, the wind, the ground speed, even the illusion of movement into your partners in flight.
This has been an incredible journey so far. We've gone from basic turns to feeling the pivotal altitude, all thanks to the magic of ground reference maneuvers. But I'm curious, so eights on pylons sound like the pinnacle of precision flying. But what does this all mean for your average non-aerobatic pilot? I mean, not everyone's out there trying to win a medal in the sky, right?
You're right. Not everyone's gunning for the airshow circuit, but the skills honed through maneuvers like eights on pylons, that heightened awareness, that intuitive connection with the aircraft, those are invaluable. Whether you're navigating a crosswind landing or simply enjoying a leisurely flight on a breezy afternoon.
It's about transferring those skills from the practice field to everyday flying.
Exactly. It's like the saying goes, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And that's what ground reference maneuvers are all about, refining those fundamental flying skills to the point where they become second nature.
So even when you're up there soaring through the clouds, you're carrying those lessons with you.
Absolutely. And it's not just about flying either. Think about the level of focus, adaptation, and split-second decision-making that pilots develop through these maneuvers. Those are transferable skills that can benefit you in countless aspects of life.
That's a great point. I never thought about it that way, but it makes sense. Whether you're facing a challenging situation at work or even just navigating a busy intersection, those skills of observation, anticipation, and quick thinking are incredibly valuable. Speaking of visual challenges, our source material, the FAA's Airplane Flying Handbook, actually talks about how pilots have to be hyper-aware of visual illusions.
That's right. It's easy to misjudge distances or altitudes when you're up in the air, especially during ground reference maneuvers. For example, have you ever noticed how a runway can look bigger or smaller depending on the terrain surrounding it?
Oh yeah, I've definitely experienced that as a passenger. If the runway is surrounded by mountains or tall buildings, it can look surprisingly small, even though it's actually the same size as always.
Exactly. And those kinds of visual illusions can really mess with your perception, especially when you're trying to maintain a precise flight path. That's why pilots train to recognize and compensate for these illusions, just like they compensate for wind drift.
It's like our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world around us, but sometimes those shortcuts our brains take can lead to misinterpretations, especially in the air.
Precisely. And that's why visual scanning and cross-checking your instruments is so important. It's about not relying solely on your senses, but also using your knowledge and training to make informed decisions.
So it's about having that balance between instinct and analysis.
Exactly. And that's what makes flying, and particularly ground reference maneuvers, such a fascinating challenge. It's this incredible blend of art and science, of human skill and the forces of nature.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. It's not just about learning to fly an airplane. It's about understanding how to navigate the world around us, both literally and metaphorically.
Beautifully said. It's about developing that heightened awareness, that ability to read the subtle cues and make those split-second adjustments that allow us to not just survive, but to thrive in any situation.
So next time you find yourself battling a metaphorical headwind, remember those pilots out there dancing with the real deal. They're a testament to the power of practice, adaptability, and a deep understanding of the forces at play.
And maybe next time you're lucky enough to catch a glimpse of a plane practicing those ground reference maneuvers, you'll have a newfound appreciation for the skill and precision required. It's a beautiful thing to watch.
It really is. Well, I think we've successfully navigated our way through the fascinating world of ground reference maneuvers today. From the basics of wind drift to the intricate choreography of eights on pylons, we've explored the skills and the science that allow pilots to achieve such remarkable precision in the air.
It's been a pleasure sharing this deep dive with you.
And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this journey as much as we have. Next time you're driving down a windy road, pay attention to those subtle adjustments you make to stay on course. Or maybe, next time you see a plane soaring overhead, you'll have a newfound appreciation for the skill and artistry involved in every maneuver. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and maybe, just maybe, keep reaching for your own personal pivotal altitude.